Thank you, everyone that is attending the session today. Thank you especially to Chief Galea, the Mayor, and the City Council, as well as the City of Los Altos leadership team. We are here today to help us reflect on the role we play in creating a more inclusive social and civic environment. This session will help provide us with strategies for reducing barriers and bias and encourage a more inclusive mindset. Facilitating our ongoing learning journey today will be Dr. Fletcher and Dr. DiCochea. Dr. Fletcher, our facilitator, is an assistant professor at San Jose State University in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He also serves as the board chair member on diversity and inclusion for the Public Relations Society of America, Silicon Valley. Dr. DiCochea, our mediator, is a communication and events associate and program coordinator for Stanford University in the School of Humanities and Sciences, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. For our attendees, please be sure to type in your questions in the Q&A section below, and the team here will do our best to address them. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher and Dr. DiCochea, for being here today to help us in this discussion. Dr. DiCochea, with that, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think that's such important work that the community of Los Altos is doing, and it's difficult work and it's necessary work. I offered and suggested that we start with a land acknowledgement. We do this often at Stanford at my place of work. So I do want to acknowledge that I am borrowing some of the language there. But I think we can extend this statement to the county, Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And I know in my own personal experience with Los Altos History Museum and other groups there, they're making a great effort to build and forge a better relationship and rebuild trust with the Muwekma Ohlone community. And it's great to see that and be a part of that. I myself was born and raised in San Jose, California. And so I just, I have a personal, very personal attachment and connection to the things that happen in the area and seeing things change over time. With that, I will hand it to Dr. Fletcher.
Dr. DiCochea, thank you so much. And I'm appreciative of Gabe, the entire staff, the mayor, the city council. I'm appreciative, quite honestly, because you continue to commit to this work. Much of it, the public is not even aware of that we are doing and that I have been a part of. And I don't give accolades very loosely when it comes to this work, because you have to show it. This is not a performative, as we've seen a lot over the last 16 months, I would say. There's a lot of performative measures that's been taking place. So while there's much more work that needs to be done, this is a significant step. So I applaud you to that extent for it. So let's get down to the business of why we are here. I am going to share my screen. And again, we do not have a tremendous amount of time. So I want to dive right into it. So I will spare you the pleasantries until we're done, or perhaps you can follow me offline and send me an email and we can talk about it, anything that may come up during this session. But I want to make sure that I preface this dialogue that we're going to have over the next 40 minutes or so. And then, of course, we'll open it up for Q&A, and Dr. DiCochea and I will converse a bit. But I always preface it, understand and acknowledge where everyone is in their journey talking about bias, understanding and confronting your own bias, because it's a very personal, intimate journey that we all have to go on in order to do it. It's very easy to look without, to speak about bias and explore others' bias, but it's a much more painstaking journey to take the accountability to identify one's own bias. We continue to be on that journey. And in that spirit, understanding where you may be on that journey, I give respect. And I hope that you also are acknowledging where you are on it. Some may be starting their journey to explore their own biases in a real way. Others are continuing on that journey. Understanding where you are, we all have to acknowledge that this is a lifelong journey. There is no end to it. And that is important for you to keep with you throughout this process, but specifically this evening as we go through it. I'd like to say, don't expect a certificate of completion to be sent to you when this is over, because that's not what this work is about. I'd be doing you a disservice, and anyone that speaks about bias would be doing you a disservice if we gave you the connotation that there was an end point. There isn't. We continue to do this work. We continue to evolve. We continue to understand. We continue to challenge. We continue to forgive. We continue to move forward as a collective, as a community, Los Altos and otherwise. We belong to many communities, including the global community. So with that preamble of sorts, I'm a social scientist of sorts. Bias is oftentimes approached from a number of different vantage points, oftentimes from a neuroscience perspective we'll hear it about. But there's a convergence, there's an intersection of the neuroscience of it all, but also the socialization of who are we? How did we come to think how we think? How do we come to view groups how we view them? And then how does that ultimately turn into actions, thoughts, behaviors that have consequences? I take that approach, and we're going to take that approach for the duration of this session. And with that in mind, I also want you to be thinking about your role within it as well. I'll constantly put the mirror up, as I always say. I'll put the mirror up to you as we're going through. And when I say you, I use the royal you. I'm talking about me as well. To identify and see yourselves in many of the different tenets that we talk about from a social standpoint, but also from a neurological standpoint, which we'll touch on a bit, okay? And while I normally do these sessions in person, we're still in this virtual space. I would normally give group agreements and house rules and all of that. I'll simply ask that you listen with positive intent. That's it. I'll ask that you listen with the intent to possibly alter your perspective and potentially your behavior. And with that intimate thought process in mind, I also want you to reflect a little bit about even the thoughts and feelings you're bringing to this session. When you heard about it, what thoughts came into mind? When you heard who was going to moderate the session, what thoughts came to mind? When you thought about bias even, what thoughts came to mind? It's important that we do that self-work, that self-reflection, to even have an opportunity to start to understand the thoughts that we bring to various sessions that ultimately become sources of bias, sources of prejudice, sources of stereotype that are never passive. I was asked this earlier this week as it related to the recent situation with former head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, John Gruden, about some of the comments that he made. Stereotypes, prejudice, bias, those are not victimless offenses. They're not. There are people who fall in its wake. So there are consequences to doing the self-work, the accountability work. So I'll ask that you continue to be thinking about those things as we continue to move through. And while I try to be very pragmatic, and I like to use visuals, because visuals stoke an emotion. Visuals make things real, to people like me at least, no matter what type of learner that you are. There's a lot that's been taking place in our world, and this is just over the past several months. This is not a long retrospective viewpoint. Things that oftentimes are the antecedents to some of these volatile conversations that we formulate an opinion on. We formulate a slant, a bias on, whether we think so or not. About the science of why we all have biases, just like that as a preview, we all have biases on each of these. And not all of them have been negative stories. Of course, you see the Corinne Jean-Pierre, the first openly gay spokeswoman, and only the second Black woman leading a White House press briefing. That happened over the past year. If you're anything like me, just shortly before we logged on, I was watching the House committee talking about the January 6th investigation. That has been a very polarizing conversation to have in both workplace circles, but also at home. Mask mandates, vaccine mandates have been polarizing conversations that we've had, all of which are impacting how we view this world, how we continue to be socialized, as a preview to what we're going to talk about a little bit later. Roe v. Wade. Scenes from the southern border involving many Haitian migrants. Of course, George Floyd, and we continue to have conversations about the Policing Act, police reform. And not the least of which is most recent, we commemorated Indigenous Peoples Day while many others commemorated Columbus Day. You want to talk about a diverging, polarizing conversation to have. And before we even move into acting on it, we have to even give credence to the thoughts that came into our head about each of these subjects when they happened, but also when I just recited them. You had a thought. I had a thought. You had an opinion. What is it based off of? But also, what are the consequences when you move into your social circles and you act upon those thoughts that you had about it? Again, unpacking and peeling back the layers of who we are is extremely important. But before you do that, you have to care. Whether I'm talking to individuals or groups or organizations, I always have to start with why you should care. Because bias is intertwined with equity and inclusion, whether you believe it or not. It is. Just as I mentioned before, bias, prejudice, stereotypes, they have consequences. There are people who are collateral damage of those who are in influential positions who hold such biases, who hold such stereotypes. I said earlier this week, I was talking to someone and I mentioned, and I'll mention it to you, that ignorance combined with power is a lethal combination. And you can add bias to that as well. So establishing why you should care is a prerequisite to substantive action. Anything that we talk about in terms of what you can and cannot do to reduce our bias and raise it from the level of subconsciousness to consciousnness so you can actually act on it and start shifting paradigms to become the people that we say we want to become, to move our society, our communities, Los Altos, forward. There's a prerequisite to that. And in my mind's eye, there tends to be one of three: legal, business, and a moral case for why you should care about bias and why you should care about the consequences of bias as it relates to equity and inclusion in our society to start with, but then also in organizations and organized places. Of course, there's a legal case to be made simply to avoid lawsuits, discrimination, hiring biases, workplace conditions. There's a business case. We saw a lot of that over the last 12 to 16 months with a bunch of press releases going out from organizations because it's good for business. But where I want to hone in on and where I want to appeal to you this evening is the moral case. And I don't usually spend a lot of time appealing to the morality of people, but I will. And it's a good indicator of where you are that you're even listening to us this evening, of where you are in your journey. So I will appeal. There is a moral imperative because bias starts with the self. Oftentimes, we will look at policies that are discriminatory. We will look at bias practices within organizations, and we'll point to those and we'll totally miss sight and lose sight of individuals created those. Individuals who had bias, who brought that into positions of power and influence, put those in practice and on the books. So it starts with us. Bias is like an ember. If it is uncorralled, it can spark disastrous consequences. So let's move on and let's start talking about us. Let's talk about us. Who are we? We have to understand who we are to understand our biases. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today because, again, this is a start for many. I'm not going to spend much time talking about organizations and bias within hiring practice. That's a conversation that we will have another day, but I'm going to focus on you. Who are we? How does socialization contribute to our biases? We have to establish a foundation before we can do that, and it's important. So let's talk about the sociology of bias, if you will, because that's how we experience it most. Because we're not aware of the neuroscience of bias, we're aware of the sociological aspects of bias, but then also the consequences of bias sociologically. Who are we bringing to this world as a friend, as a coworker, as a spouse, as a parent, as a leader? Many different roles that we tend to play in this world. Assess who are you bringing to those spaces. So we have to discuss the social antecedents of bias, and it starts with understanding that we all belong to social groups, what are called social groups. So I'm going to move into professor mode for a second, if you don't mind. We all belong to social groups. Social groups are a group of people who share a range of physical, cultural, or social characteristics within one of the social identity categories, which we'll talk about next. We are made up of two social and personal identities. We'll talk about each of those. For personal identities, as human beings, we have a personal identity. These are those identities that we get to choose, underscore the operative phraseology there is that we get to choose them, that are related to our interests and hobbies or are related to the things that we enjoy. For example, you may be an avid jogger, a runner, dog lover, hip hop music fan, an employee of the company of your choice. It can be anything that you identify with, but is not related to a history of your particular group fighting for rights because they have been discriminated against because of that identity, like racism, like sexism, like ageism, xenophobia. But then where we begin to diverge, this is where the intersection of social identities and bias often become volatile and have major social ramifications when it starts to intersect with our social identities. Let's talk a little bit about what those are. Social identities are those identities that are related to a history of discrimination, oppression, or having more power or privilege based solely on where we fall on that identity category. For example, social identities include race, ethnicity, gender, religious identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, age, ability or disability status, and immigration citizenship status. All of these are tied to some form of ism if you go down the spectrum: racism, sexism, classism, ageism, so on and so forth. And you may notice that there are a couple on there that I've had some question and say, don't you choose? Don't you choose some of these statuses? Don't you choose your immigration citizenship status? Tell that to certain populations that, again, because of duress coming from many different environments and situations to where they find themselves in countries, whether it be the United States, I'm not simply talking about the US, in other countries, to where they find themselves there, and they would challenge you whether that was a choice, whether it was voluntary or not. Also, and if you can recall, and it wasn't that long ago, talking about bias and speaking of prejudice, wasn't that long ago to where you'll see one label on here, sexual orientation, that you can recall. And I'm old enough to understand and remember when it was called something else. It was called sexual preference. Remember? And we had to evolve. Hopefully you have. We had to evolve to understand and begin to acknowledge and respect those within the LGBTQ plus community who continued to move and have dialogue to get society at large to understand that it is not a preference. Stop calling it that. There are many different social identities that continue to pervade us as human beings and social entities that, when intersected with bias, have significant social consequences. And there are many examples in history and social justice, social movement histories that I could point to, but for the sake of time, let's move forward and investigate a little bit more about who we are in terms of social identity. Our identities have characteristics. They are multiple, meaning they can happen simultaneously. I am a male. I am heterosexual. I am what is constituted as able-bodied in by CDC classifications. I have multiple identities that operate simultaneously, as do you. They are interconnected as well. You cannot isolate and separate one of them from the other ones. Some talk about whether they can change, whether they're a choice, and I'll move through so I can make sure that we cover as much material while we're together as possible. Some are observable, some are not. Some are salient. Some question whether, are we always aware of our identities? No, we're not. But understanding a little bit more now, talking about how social identities intersect with the sociology of who we are as individuals. This is what's called a social identity profile. And if you would like to have a copy of it, feel free, send me an email and I will share it with you once we conclude. But I want you to reflect on it while we're together, because this is where our social identities start to show themselves in society and oftentimes create diverging consequences. It separates us. Oftentimes, yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Duche.
Oh yeah, it's just we got a question in that I think it would be great to kind of
go for it. Would you mind sharing it with me? Go for it.
Yeah. This is from Gary Hedden. Hi Gary. I happen to know Gary Hedden. He writes, there are two other groups, those who are quote unquote successful and everyone else. The book, The Tyranny of Merit, gets at that, and it's a very polarizing division. What is your opinion on that division? And it was interesting. I want to add that Gary's question came in at this time because I wanted to interject anyway to along the similar lines to ask you what at this point, what would you say to those who say that acknowledging these differences is itself problematic and divisive?
In terms of class or power or privilege or socioeconomic status?
Any of these social identity groupings, that acknowledging these things, primarily in race, ethnicity, class, is where there's an argument that's problematic and divisive. And it's along the similar lines of this colorblind society approach. So it kind of overlaps with what Gary's mentioning here, this book, Tyranny of Merit. So this polarizing division, those who are successful and everyone else.
So we're good, and that's an interesting construct in terms of success, which has to be unpacked in and of itself. But success oftentimes is equated with power dynamics, with socioeconomic strata, because those are not hard bounded defined areas, if that makes sense. That's why I said that understanding a little bit more about what those entail, because success looks different to everyone. And I understand what you mean by success. That usually equates with, when we move into talking about the subject matter that we're talking about this evening, that moves into your social identities of socioeconomic status and class. And if we move outside of the United States and the macro and micro cultures, if you will, classism shows itself differently across international and intercultural lines as well. Understanding power dynamics shows itself differently as well. The important part, and this will come out as we continue to talk, the interesting part about power dynamics that divide us is oftentimes understanding how we got to that point. how we got to the point, not the actual manifestations of success equivalent to power and money and so on and so forth, but socially, how do we arrive at a point to where we retreat to our corners along the lines of these different social identifiers and socioeconomic classes, but one of those. So we'll come back to that. So hang tight a little bit as we move through. But that's an excellent example, and we'll make sure that we make note of that so those who are listening can take advantage of that resource. So let's, for the sake of time, let's move through a little bit more, and hopefully some of that will come out in the content that we're talking about. All right. So understanding this social identity and coming back to this social identity profile, which again, I want you to spend some time thinking about, and offline we'll send this out to you if you make the request. This is where we start to see division amongst the intersection of our social identities along the lines of society. When they start to show us that we're not all the same, when they start to show us some of the ugliness and divergence of society. And you'll see along the left axis where it lists out various social identity groupings. And of course, that's not an exhaustive list. And then you identify your membership to those. But then it gets into the social aspect of it. Which social identity are you most aware of? Which social identity do you think about the least? That's when we start moving into privilege. Which gives you the most privilege in your estimation. Also, which social identity that you hold perhaps limits your options and access to rewards, because most civilizations act along the dynamic of reward and punishment, a system of reward and punishment. Which do you think limit you or gives access? Which would you like to know more about? Which makes you most comfortable? And the last few, which has the strongest effect on the way that you see yourself, which has the greatest positive effect on how others see you, and lastly, which has the greatest negative effect on how others see you. And a quick reflection exercise, I extracted 3 of those that are the most salient that I want you to think about. And of course, we're not together, so you'll have to do this and think through it on your own as we move through. And I want you to think about it as we pivot to understanding bias after this. What social identity grouping are you most aware of? And I will use myself as an example. Oftentimes, many will gravitate towards what is most prevalent. I cannot hide my skin color. I cannot hide that. That is a social identity that I am most aware of because society shows me. Society tells me that you are Black in many different ways that we'll talk more about, even throughout my socialization, that from an adolescent to an adult. Which social identity grouping do you think about the least? I would say my sexual orientation, because again, society, unlike our brothers and sisters within the LGBTQ plus community, the trans community, they don't tell me, they don't ask me why am I heterosexual. Society doesn't ask those questions. So think about and reflect upon those, and it'll tell you the positions that you're oftentimes in, and oftentimes how and why you view certain groups and certain situations the way that we view them. And last 2, and I see you came off of mute, Dr. Digochea. Let me go through the last 2. Hopefully you have a question that came in. What social identity grouping gives you the most privilege? And for me, I would say, again, in this United States society, being a male gives me the most privilege still. We still live in a very masculine, oftentimes toxic, masculine society that we live in. And while some would say, no, you don't have privilege because people of marginalized, disenfranchised, historically communities cannot have those, that's not true. That's not true. That's looking at a macro viewpoint of identity. Now, while again, you have to get into the details of it, but from a sociological perspective, breaking down our different social identities that then lead into understanding who we are so we can understand our biases. We also have to understand that as well. And the last piece, which social identity group has the greatest negative effect on how others see you. Again, I will refer back to number 1, because I do not know your experiences with people within my cultural community, within my racial community. I do not know those. So when I come into situations, I oftentimes do not know until it's made evident to me that I am being approached a certain way because of my skin color. Each of us have our own answers to these. And I want you to be thinking through, again, bias and attacking bias and understanding it is a very intimate process, uncomfortable oftentimes. Dr. Digochea, did you have a question that came in?
I just think this slide is so important. I know you have so many important things to cover and wonderful slides, but I just wanted to slow down a minute on this because this is such an important piece of the process of unveiling your biases. And I wanted to ask you for a little more help because everyone is at different levels of this, depending on all the factors that you're mentioning, right? And so question number 3 is a big one. How does one even begin to start unpacking that if they don't even recognize themselves as privileged? So I don't know if you can explain more. How did you begin recognizing your privilege as a male in this patriarchal society? How did that even begin for you as an example of that this is not an easy kind of awareness?
And that's a great question, and I'll try to add a bit more meat on the bones, if you will, as we move forward. But personally speaking, I mentioned a little bit earlier when I talked about why you should even care. Everyone, the pre-step to taking action is having whether it's an aha moment that shifts your paradigm, whatever it is, having an opportunity to unpack why you should care about something, because none of us are perfect. None of us are an embodiment of the United Nations, and we respect and understand and give voice and acknowledge everything that encompasses socioculturally who we all are as individuals. I had aha moments just like everybody else. When I had a daughter, gender discrimination issues became one of my top issues. Not ashamed to say that was one of the seminal moments that shifted my paradigm. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because I will tear up and you don't want to see that. However, that shifted my thinking. You can see her right over my shoulder there. Shifted my thinking on those issues. But also, I could not just look at the issues of gender inequity without saying, you know what, Sean, you're on the beneficiary side of that as well. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? Are you just going to wag your finger and say we should do better? You're profiting off of a lot of gender discrimination. You have profited unknowingly. I'd like to think it was unknowingly. But I had to also understand, and it did not take me going through a bias or a privilege or seminar for me to understand that if somebody's benefiting, it is on the backs of somebody else. That is how civilization works. And I became very, very mindful and guilty, quite honestly, about that. And it didn't just stop at guilt. It was a catalyst for me to go do something. Quite honestly, it was a spark to do some of the work that we're even doing here today that brought me to you. So understanding what your aha moment is, what do you care about? While you may not wake up saying, I care about all these social and socio-political and social justice issues, we all have someone or something even in our lives that we hold dearly, that we do not want to see disparaged or discriminated against, especially not to the benefit of ourselves at their peril. I saw that. And it wasn't an epiphany, the clouds didn't part. I saw it firsthand. And I said, I acknowledge that this is happening. I do not want to see this world moving forward in this direction with this trend and my daughter growing up in it. Nor do I want to see my son perpetuating the imbalance of gender equity that we see in this world. I had to do something about it. And that goes across many different social ills that I have seen in this world that impacted me. And that's my hope, and that's my message to anyone who listens to me, is to find your aha moment. It may not be anything that I talked about tonight, may not be anything that Dr. Digochea talks about tonight, but the first step is acknowledgement that you care about it and awareness of it all. And that self-reflective work that we're talking about, it is unearthed through that, to where you start to identify your areas of privilege. No privileges, and I'm previewing a little bit of what I plan to talk about, but no privilege is not simply white and male. While society will push us completely in that direction, it's not. It's a part of it, and that's a conversation for a different day. However, privilege takes on a number of different faces from a social identity standpoint. And as a Black male, I certainly, growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, that is heavily racially polarized, and we reactions oftentimes to issues of race, I had to step outside of that and realize that, Sean, there's more to this social connection that we have as individuals, as human beings, than race. Now, we will talk about race. However, while my shift is disproportionately on that, as I was younger growing up, I was losing the people I was stepping on with the other areas of privilege that I enjoyed that I never gave credence to. That's the challenge that I put to those listening, but also anybody that I talk with, and I'll continue to do that. So hopefully that answered your question a bit, but let's talk about bias. Let's talk about bias. Well, we've laid the foundation of who we are, our social identities, how complicated they are, how they can become very volatile when they intersect with issues of bias and stereotypes. Let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience of bias, and then we'll move and talk about how that manifests itself socially. And we'll talk a bit about what we can do to challenge some of those biases, interrupt them, and then we'll open it up for questions. But let's understand bias. What is implicit or unconscious, otherwise known as? Every human being makes immediate snap decisions about new people or new things. It is purely instinctual. Do not let anybody tell you that you do not have bias. Hopefully you understand that. We all do. Let me debunk that this evening. We all do. All right? Because it happens below the level of consciousness. You don't even know that it's happening. It happens faster than we can even comprehend, as quickly as, and the science says, quickly as 30 milliseconds. Once the brain has made a decision on something, it then categorizes things. And that moves into some of the nature versus nurture, fight or flight. In a split instance, you don't have a choice to sit and think about, there's imminent danger, what should I do? Your brain is wired as such to where, based upon previous experiences in similar environments with similar stimuli, you will make a quick decision. But what happens when that decision is made on a person? What happens when a person is the consequence or collateral damage of said decisions that you make? The process is called unconscious bias, and it can have a huge influence and huge ramifications, because anytime that we have experiences, not only as we learned in middle school, it creates wrinkles in our brain, of course it does, but when we have new experiences, our brain creates what are called cognitive tags. It's almost like if you tagged or labeled some food that you put in the refrigerator so you can come back to it later. You tag experiences with people, places, things, whatever it is. And it happens below the level of consciousness. From there, you create what are called schemas or mental templates, which tell you how to conduct yourself in said situation or environment, or when you come in contact with those things or experiences or people that you have tagged cognitively. This leads to stereotypes and possibly biases. And again, understand there is no disparagement of that. That is a neurological process that you cannot change. But when it moves into the sociological side of bias, we do have an opportunity to interrupt that. But let's unpack stereotypes versus bias a little bit more. Stereotypes is it's not mutually exclusive, but it is different than bias. A stereotype is a conventional, formulaic, and oversimplified conception, opinion, or image. One who stereotypes generally thinks that most or all members of an ethnic or racial group or other social identifiers are all the same. Stereotype, generalization. Bias, however, has much more dire and aggressive consequences. Bias is a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial, judgment. The use of bias is more subtle, however, hence where implicit or unconscious bias came from. Often it is evident through the addition of qualifiers or added information to spoken statements. Let's unpack a little bit more of the differences. Stereotypes are assumptions about individuals or groups of people based on generalizations, whereas bias are beliefs based on perspectives about individuals or groups of people in favor. That's where the delineation, the divergence takes place, in favor or against something. And we've seen many stereotypes in our society. I don't have to label many of them, but I'll just go back to the last several months. I still hear it in many of the classes that I teach. Asians are good at math. We've seen it in the news. Anybody heard of the model minority myth that has disproportionately plagued the Asian community for a very long time, not simply over the last year. It's just become a bit more enlarged in the media. Happened a long time ago. That's a historical conversation for a different day. Stereotypes that some will claim are good. There are no such thing as good stereotypes. And bias, examples of that. Again, the qualifiers that are oftentimes accompanied by a bias. I remember growing up in St. Louis, Missouri. If we were in a hospital or a medical facility, I would hear people put prefaces on a male nurse or a female doctor, which denotes that somehow that is not the norm. Doctor is a doctor. Nurse is a nurse. But in certain societies, based upon the biases that we ascribe to certain roles, we will disparage those individuals by somehow saying it's exceptional, indicating it's exceptional, a male nurse. Nurse is gender neutral. Doctor is gender neutral. But I still hear people to this day, mainly back east, but I hear people to this day put those qualifiers on it. Dr. Digoche, is there a question? I see you came off of mute.
Well, yeah, I just,
Go ahead.
you know, in my work, in my background is in ethnic studies. I earned my PhD in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, and was only there. So we were very well trained on racial formation theory, and stereotypes is understood as a racial project that is essentially dehumanizing, right? It's essentially dehumanizing, whether it's a positive or negative stereotype, it dehumanizes a person. Someone as less than human. Very problematic, right? People, you know, work their whole lives on a research project just to prove really an essential point that X group of historically discriminated against people are in fact human, right? So that said, I'm wondering if you could talk more about the relationship between these two,
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, the stereotypes are not neutral, as you mentioned.
Mm-mm.
And if we already have these ingrained stereotypes, right, there's got to be some connection within what shapes our biases.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we should be getting from this slide? Can you speak on that a little bit?
Sure. Bias and stereotypes, there's a fine line between the two. And again, when they intersect with how we actually behave with one another, there are significant consequences of it. Stereotypes, again, making assumptions, and I still contest, and there are many different theorists and sociologists who posit that there are a such thing as positive stereotypes. I think consequentially, no, they're all damaging. But of course, when they are spoken, there tends to be sentiment that's assigned to different types of stereotypes. Well, I look at outcomes as opposed to inputs. So the outcomes of them, as you mentioned, they dehumanize. And to talk a bit more about the harmful effects of them, when you look at both stereotypes and biases, whether it is at the onset of the offense or it is a paper trail down the line that leads to harm because of it, the end result is still harm. So even understanding how our biases and the way that our minds map certain experiences and categorize groups of people so we can identify how we should behave in certain situations, yes, they lend themselves to stereotypes. They lend themselves to biases, but they don't sentence us to them. That is where oftentimes the awareness and the understanding that these things are happening and that they are of harm is when we can take back control, and it raises it from the level of unconsciousness to the level of consciousness, where now we do have accountability and a responsibility to do something about it because of many of these harmful effects of stereotypes and biases. And I won't go through each of them, but Dr. Digochea framed it very well. They dehumanize. They don't respect individuality and uniqueness of who we are as individuals, as proudful cultural beings. They don't allow for us to be everything that makes us who we are per the social identities that we talked about a bit earlier. And you can read on the slide for yourselves some of the many, many harmful effects, the division that it creates, the flat out harm. And then if you bring this is on a personal level, bring this into the workplace, it has created glass ceilings. It has set careers back. It has boxed people into their potential or lack thereof that they're giving credence to. The workplace conversation is a totally different conversation. This evening, we're just talking about us. But take this and move it into the workplace. Take this and move it into entertainment. Take this and move it into media. That's why you see a lot of what you see. That's why you hear a lot of what you hear. But the more positive takeaway is that stereotypes and biases, they are still learned behaviors. Now, while the neuroscientific side of it, those are antecedents to stereotypes and biases. But when stereotypes and biases intersect with our sociology, which we're going to talk about next, how we're socialized into this, they are learned behaviors. Thinking that certain groups are good at certain things or bad at certain things, those are learned behaviors. Your brain did not map that. Don't let anyone tell you that. Thinking that certain groups are inferior to other groups, your brain didn't map that. Those aren't hardwired. Those are learned behaviors. Thinking that a broad generalization of everyone is like this, so I'm going to lock my car door, or I'm going to walk to the other sidewalk, or I'm not going to pick this person for our group project because I had a bad experience with somebody like that before. Those are learned behaviors, and learned behaviors can be unlearned. That's the significant takeaway of that. But I want to talk a bit more about who we are. How did these learned behaviors come about? And it's important for us to understand something called the cycle of socialization. And again, moving into the sociology of bias, how we become who we are. In my mind's eye, there's nothing more important than zeroing in on who we are and how we were socialized. We are not starting in the left side of this graphic here. And again, this is another graphic. Feel free to take a screenshot. I'll send it to you if you send me an email. Understanding that we are not born into this world with these stereotypes and with these biases or any learned behaviors just yet. And you've heard that cliche before. We weren't born to hate. We weren't born for all of this. But then if you move clockwise around this cycle of socialization, you'll start to understand a little bit more of how we became who we are as grown-ups now. Our first socialization, typically with parents, guardians, relatives, teachers, people we respect and who we revere, who oftentimes send us on a negative track if we're really being transparent. Even those people that you love and revere. My parents taught me, so they are the greatest people I've ever met, but they taught me some bad habits. If we're being honest, they absolutely did. Of how to view this world, they absolutely did. And I'm sure I've passed that along. We're not infallible, all right? But that's the first step of socialization. When you start to see your loved ones and your guardians doing certain things, you start modeling yourself. That's how you start to view and shape the world. They teach you. Then you have reinforced institutions, churches, places of worship, schools that you're put into, television and the media, legal system, cultural practices, music you expose yourself to. Those are institutions that reinforce. And oftentimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because we will expose ourselves to those institutions, media or otherwise, that reinforce what we learned in the previous step. And oftentimes, and if you're anything like me, I oftentimes continued on what I learned from my guardians, what they watched. If they watched CNN, guess what I started watching until I realized I need to expose myself to more. If they watched certain shows, if they had certain belief systems, places of worship even, until I got to an age where I could start making my own decisions, guess what I brought with me? Socialization. And then you continue to enforce those. Because again, as a system, and we live in systems of reward and punishment, those are enforced even. You're told with different ways of showing you things of affirmation or potential penalty as you move through society. And as we move again clockwise around this, oftentimes you're very, very, very set in your ways. Because these aren't coming from everyday individuals. These are coming from people you revere, who are telling you that these people are like this. That you should stay with your race. I was told that. I'll be transparent. You don't have to say anything, raise your hand. You don't have to do anything, especially if you're watching with somebody else. I'll be the example. I was told that. It's easier. It's less dangerous. Stay with your race. Marry someone within your race. From loved ones. Cycle of socialization that moves you to thinking about people in a certain way that you don't so easily unlearn as you get older, as you move forward. And then for the sake of time, I'll move through because, again, I implore you, take a screenshot of it so you can sit with this at your leisure. But then as you move forward, that's in behaviors. There are consequences to that. Societal consequences. And as we move forward through our socialization and our lived experiences, to a proverbial fork in the road where you can continue that, or you can decide that you're going to take a different approach and have that aha moment, as Dr. Digochea and I talked about a bit earlier, and stop the cycle as you became aware that was potentially destructive. In the given examples that I gave, I had an aha moment. There are still some right turns that I took that I still need to do self-work on, let's be honest. But I did take some left turns, as you see on this chart here. Dr. Digochea, go ahead.
Yeah, well, considering that we have 5 minutes left, we got another great question in
Go for
related
it.
to what you're talking about now in your slide. This is from Janine Valadez, also an amazing community leader, Los Altos, doing wonderful work around racial equity and application of these in specific policies. He writes, humans by nature categorize and describe. How do we value and respect cultural communities different from our own without devolving into descriptive stereotypes?
I think understanding, and we are moving low on time, so that is a fantastic segue to talking a bit about reducing our biases. And I'll answer that question as I sort of close us into our time that we have. But I'll speak from personal experience, but then also I'll speak a bit from the research, the social scientific research as well. Is one, again, understanding and becoming aware of what you're doing is important. Because again, as a collective, it's very difficult for us to attack and confront our biases and our stereotypes. It starts with an individual. A collective starts with an individual on an individual level. That's why I speak to individuals as opposed to groups from a macro vantage point. But collecting information is one of the tried and true sociological things that we can do in order to start to confront and challenge some of our biases. Oftentimes biases and stereotypes and some of the broad brushstrokes and the labels that we place on people are simply due to ignorance. They're not even always malicious. Some are, let's be honest. But oftentimes ignorance and a lack of knowledge and understanding, one, it doesn't allow for you to speak from an educated perspective, but two, it does not allow for you to speak from the vantage point of acknowledging and honoring all of the uniqueness that this group, fill in the blank group, brings. Knowledge it doesn't just bring power. Knowledge also tends to bring a measure of respect and reverence and honor. And that's what we mean by seeing people. When people say, it's become cliche, but when we say we don't feel seen, you see us. We don't mean optically. We're talking seeing the uniqueness of who we are. And that starts with the self-reflection. That starts with doing the work. That starts with understanding. That starts with thinking outside of yourself. Yes, that does start with empathy, but it doesn't end there. Empathy oftentimes is just a catalyst to do the work to understand the groups that you don't understand. So there's a lot to unpack in that question. It's a great question, but let's talk a little bit more about it because I want to leave you with this before we move too far. There's so much to unpack within bias, but I don't want to leave our time together without going through these. You also want to divide out facts from our opinions, theories, and suppositions as a way of reducing our personal bias. And no greater example than current examples where we continue to hear people saying, I'm doing my research, usually as it relates to vaccines and so on and so forth. I'm doing my research. What does that mean? What does it mean from a sociocultural perspective? What does it mean when we're now talking about groups of people? What does it mean when we're now talking about sociological implications of it? Especially in this age of misinformation and disinformation, where we're hearing a lot of, and you'll see it on here as well, the last bullet point, when you'll see many different media portrayals that, again, go back to the cycle of socialization. If you simply expose yourself to media portrayals that reinforce existing belief systems, you won't have a chance to divide out what's opinions, theories, suppositions, assumptions from what is factual about a group of people. And the last few is you then make your judgments based off of those facts. How often have you engaged in a debate or perhaps a dialogue when a lot of changes took place and there was really no fact that was thrown into it at all? We have to be mindful of that. And the last few, periodically refine your judgments based on those facts. Again, you have to look for those aha moments. You have to look for the things that matter to you in life. And that's a personal assessment. That's a personal reflection. The things that matter to you may not matter to me. It may not matter to your peer or your colleague. Find those and use those as catalysts as well. Also, give people opportunity to be different than who you thought they were. We're so pervaded and bombarded by media portrayals, by stereotypes. Then we have our own unconscious bias we're fighting with. That's why I asked you one simple rule going into this. Go into it with positive intent. Live every day with positive intent, especially when you are moving and engaging in intercultural, interpersonal relationships. Assuming positive intent, giving people an opportunity to possibly change and move out of this box that you may have cognitively put them in through our socialization. And the last couple, engage in honest dialogue with others about uncomfortable conversations. Have that uncomfortable dialogue intrapersonally first, which is to yourself. You need to assess your thoughts on some of the seminal issues that are going on in our world, in our community, in Los Altos. What are your thoughts on those? How are they impacting your behaviors? How are they impacting your conversations? It's not about the conversations that you have when everyone's watching. It's about the thoughts and conversations you have in your quiet time, when your boss isn't there, when there is no public shaming that could possibly take place. What are the conversations you're having at the dinner table? What were the conversations that you had growing up at the dinner table that contributed to how you think about the world, how you view the world, how you view groups of people? Not just things, people. That's where you begin to do the self-work that lets you unlearn some of the things that we all have learned over the years and decades that have become who you are and who we are, who I am, this very day, that contributes to our biases, that contributes to the very things that we are trying to surmount to become the people that comprise the communities like Los Altos and the overarching macro society that we're all trying to be. That starts with the self. That starts with us as individuals. So my challenge to you is do the work. Always continue to do the work, because confronting bias, whether it's personal or whether it is interrupting bias, microaggressions, culture taxation, the like, it takes courage to do it. Because as soon as you try to, I liken it to a minefield. As soon as you try to, with your best effort, oftentimes it can still go awry. Do it anyway. When you have that conversation to interrupt your loved one, your mother, your parent, your loved one that you revere, and they say something about that group of people, those people are like this. You be careful when you're around these people. These people are all like this. Will you have the courage to interrupt it? Will you have the courage to see how you processed it and perpetuated it, maybe? That takes courage. just like these individuals that you see who are sweeping a live, active minefield that you see. It's a very powerful image. They knew at any moment they could have done everything right, and boom. A lot of what we've talked about and the work that we need to continue to do as a community, as a society, that starts with ourselves personally, to confront our bias, to take the accountability and ownership of what we do and who we bring to our social spaces, not anybody else, who we bring to those spaces, takes courage, takes chances, takes risks. It takes you wanting to not just say, but to do the work. So there are a number of resources. I appreciate you. Again, we could go on for another 2 hours about this content, but I will not. I thank you, Dr. Digochea. I thank you, Gabe. I appreciate you. Mayor, I appreciate you. These are a number of different resources. Harvard University has a fantastic The Preeminent Implicit Bias project that you can go to their site and start to take different types of unconscious and implicit bias assessments. I encourage you to do that as well. And there are a number of resources also. And Dr. Digochea, if it's still available, the resource that was cited earlier is also, I encourage you to take a look at that as well, to continue to expose yourself to more information as you move through this journey. And I wish you well on that journey. And if I can be of assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Digochea and Gabe. I know we're at time, but I appreciate you.
I know we're out of time, Gabe, but this is really great and really important. And I really applaud the City of Los Altos for organizing these sessions. It's a lifelong journey, and that the city is doing this as a community, doing this individual work together in community. I think it's really fantastic. And so perseverance is key, right? There's going to be a lot of mistakes made, like that minefield, but that goes with the territory, right?
Absolutely.
It's the good fight. It's the good fight.
Thank you, Dr. Digochea. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. For everyone attending, we'll make this available on our website, and we'll also put it out in the next city manager's update. And we appreciate the conversation this evening and the challenge at the end to learn more and to confront our bias. So with that, we'll sign off tonight, but thank you for everyone who attended. And thank you again to Drs. Digochea and Fletcher.